Hey everybody, I'm Ramon Mejia. I'm here to give you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews. With me today, I'm talking to a gentleman whose story I've read for the last couple of years. He's the author of the Dream State Saga. He's actually here to talk about his third book in the series, Ghost in the Game, the third book in the Dream State Saga series. It'll be out on March the 19th, which is when most of you will be watching this particular episode of the podcast. Help me welcome to the show, Christopher Keene. Hey, Christopher.
Hey.
And with that wonderful hello, everybody, I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to me. And I probably have lots of writer things to do. But I also know you're not. This is kind of early for you because you're in a different country. You're in New Zealand.
Yeah, this is morning for me, and I'm really keen to have a chat because I've been watching your stuff for a while as well. Bam, right into it.
Yep. See, there you go. And I know I think you mentioned you had questions for me as far as like anything else. And we wanted those to kind of be surprise questions for me because I think it's only fair when I talk to somebody, if they have questions, they can ask me at any point during the thing. So if you feel free to ask any questions you have as well. But in the beginning, for people who don't know who you are, don't know who you write, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a New Zealand author and full-time geek. Or is it the other way around? No, for a long time, I was just a career academic. Then I went into private security. I worked at a mental asylum for about a year. So I learned a lot about mental health and medication through that. And I used a lot of that in the books.
Perfect. I'm kind of curious, like what you said you were in academia. What were you, what branch were you in?
I did English literature, but alongside I did history, a little bit of history. I did a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of psychology, just had a taste of all different little things before I decided writing is fun.
Cool. So you actually have a background in actual writing, which is not always the case with like a lot of LitRPG writers.
Yeah. I kind of wrote before I, obviously went into academia, but at the same time, I was interested in improving my craft, how I could use the techniques that, good authors did. And so I learned a lot through that.
Perfect. It's always good to have somebody who knows what they're doing. It's often, honestly, as somebody people call a writer, I've written some things and they've sold decently well. A lot of the times, I just feel like I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm kind of faking it. And I think that's okay.
Make it till you make it.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, that's fine with me, but talking to somebody who's actually done the time to be a professional and learn all the things about English and writing that they're supposed to know, I'm like, oh, that's definitely different and cool.
Well, it doesn't always go hand to hand with success, but it definitely, it's an interesting craft to kind of delve into in that level. I would not recommend someone doing that in academia at the moment, but definitely, study other authors. That's a really good way of putting it, is if you study other authors, and I'm sure you do, you read a lot of different people, so you'd know that you can learn a lot from them.
No, absolutely. And it's always the case, like honing your craft and learning how to do things better doesn't necessarily mean go to college. I mean, it can for some people, and that's definitely the case. If that's how you learn best. I know Jeffrey fucking Logue, he's an author of the Slam Ninja Chronicles. He went back to school to learn how to be a better writer and to do some other things because that's how he learns best. But other authors can just analyze and just research and test and do it experimentally, almost like, how can I improve what I'm doing, reading novels and books on research and writing, and that works for them as well. But before we go off into like all this writer talk, tell me a little bit about your series, the Dream State Saga.
Well, basically it's about this kid called Nathan and Noah. I forgot my own main character for a second. Nathan's the main character in another book. Anyway, Noah gets paralyzed in a car crash, and his girlfriend, spoilers. Anyway, he essentially tries to find justice for the people that caused this accident, this car crash, because it was all planned prior. And throughout the series, he realizes that each of these little investigations he does, or little, conflict management things he does, is all in the game that the company that caused the crash created. So in that respect, it's just a really good way of almost having a mystery or action-packed adventure in a game while trying to solve a real-world problem.
Right, definitely. That's a really good summary, I think, of like part of the first book. I think it gets deeper and deeper the more you get into, because I think we should talk about this series as in like this is the third book in it. Is it okay if we like talk about some of the spoilers in books 1 and 2, because like they've been out for a while? I think the 6-month spoiler period on those is kind of over a little bit, especially when we're in the third book. And by the way, is this going to be the last book in this series, or is this another part of it?
It depends on my publisher.
Oh, yeah, no, it does. I always forget. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. That's not always up to the author to make that call. But
so often my publisher, like during like the second half of the year, might say, hey, we want another Dream State book. Can you do that? Can you give that to us as soon as possible? And I'm like, I haven't even written it yet. And I'm like, all right, I'll send you one soon.
Yeah. But even if I've read Dream State Saga book 3, I think this is actually a really good place to like stop it if for whatever reason they don't wish to continue. Like this is, you've done a lot of like the mystery solving by the end of this, but I think it's a good, there's still room for like more stuff. Like you left the dangly part there to continue on in this series if you want to, but even if it ended here, I would be like, okay, I'm okay with that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The guy who's, the one who physically was at fault for causing him to get stuck in the game in the first book is, he's found justice. He's, put in front of a trial by the end of the third one. So it's like, oh, well, that's that story arc solved. There's this little thing that you missed out though, but at least that one is away. And
right, there's some kind of resolution for like the first arc at least. And I think that's at least, it's nice to say, even if you have to pause or something. But I think one of the core ideas of like the story in itself is a very interesting and different is that you don't use just virtual reality technology in your particular novels. You incorporate other things like drug-inducing dream state to include. You also still include virtual reality, but it's also like part of the system is from their dreams and from their minds. And I thought it was a very interesting and different way of introducing like a virtual reality simulation world.
Right. Well, I find that with a lot of VR books and a lot of VR ideas, there's always the problem of how are you going to simulate touch and movement in a way that doesn't just feel like you're laying in a bed wearing goggles, you know what I mean? Or a helmet or something. So it's like, what's the most realistic way of doing that without getting, like a treadmill or being in a pod or just linking straight into the brain Matrix style,
right?
And I thought, well, dreams are quite realistic, you can have dreams that are so realistic and you can even control them if you are good enough at lucid dreaming. What if there was a drug that could put you into that state and be manipulated, via brainwaves or whatever you want to call it? But yeah, it was a fun idea and I kind of just went from there.
Yeah, and that's definitely something you explore a lot in the first book as far as like, explain the technology, how the drugs are interacting with the system. But you still get that same kind of virtual reality MMORPG kind of vibe in the actual story of itself. But that same kind of concept of the dream state being an integral part of the system definitely comes back in book 3. Like that's a really big part of like, this is, you guys didn't realize this was happening, but this is totally happening here. And it ties back to the beginning. So that when I read it, I was like, oh, okay, so he's doing a callback to book 1. And I'm like, okay, that's cool.
Full circle, yeah. Full circle.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk a little about your characters. You have your main character, Noah. Noah, like I said, he in book 1, it starts off with him in a car accident. He's paralyzed. He's in, I think, a coma for most of that first book. And that this isn't spoilery. It's in the, it's in the novel description. And his big goal is basically to not die there, so that the doctors can hopefully bring him back. And he's looking for his girlfriend, who who was in the car accident with him. And he hopes she's alive, but he thinks that maybe she's there with him the same way he is. And of course, that isn't always end up being the case. So by the end of the story, you kind of realize that that's tragic things happen. But then like the story just becomes a part of like, him going on a mission to like figure out who caused it and why. And that becomes like a subplot of the story. What makes Noah so special as a character to you though?
Well, he is paralyzed, but that's not the special you mean, I assume.
No.
Well, he's got quite a good knack for finding stuff like broken game mechanics or just hidden areas. I find, especially in the first book when he's just exploring the place, and I think he's really driven to a fault, like to the point like he almost like causes his own problems in a lot of way, because he's like, right, I'm gonna go to this dungeon because something tells me that I have to go there, even though it's obviously a trap. It's just like, no, wait, hang on, think about this. And it's just like, no, I'm going. And that's one of his character flaws, that he thinks he's fixing as each book goes along. He thinks he's like, no, I've learned from my previous mistake. It's okay, guys. And then you realize, no, you didn't.
Yeah, so good. So that, I mean, his drive is definitely part of it, even to the extent of like continuing. I think it's one of the things he can't say he's wrong necessarily. I think that's part of it as well, and that he'll make a bad decision, but he'll commit to it fully. Like he'll dive headlong into like essentially what everyone else sees as a bad decision, but because he thinks he's right, he'll continue on with it. Unfortunately, so there are definitely things that are very interesting about the character as well.
Yeah, character reactions to essentially him making those decisions can border on, like, I'm just going to let you do you and, do your own thing, whatever, I don't want to be involved, to, are you crazy? This is literally going against what we were planning from the beginning, and I quite like those sort of conflicts between the minor and major characters.
Perfect. Now, speaking of the other minor characters, is there anybody else in this series that you had really fun writing with besides your main character?
Oh, Sienna. Sienna was so fun. Everyone loves Sienna. Sienna is this crazy... She's pretty much just the female version of Leroy Jenkins. She just runs into stuff and has fun. And she's... essentially, there's another character called Daedalin, and he says a line that was used in promotion, which was, you don't just survive in the game, you have to play it. You really have to, play it to enjoy it. You have to be engaged. And she's like the definition of that idea, because all she cares about is having fun. So she was fun to write.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the bigger concepts in like book one is that, there are these special weapons that are like unique, and they kind of classify people as heroes. And like it's one of the like higher end game system items. And I think she holds one of them, I believe, right?
Yeah, one of the color blades.
Yeah.
She holds the ruby edge, which is, fits her appeal because she's like a flaming redhead. But at the same time, she the thing about the weapons is that they've got one specific quality, and that's they're pretty much unbreakable. And I used kind of a Dark Souls approach in that respect, where like if you hit something with a weapon, then it can break and you have to mend it, whereas that's one of the few weapons where you can just keep on hitting and it doesn't break. And so a lot of people want those weapons.
Right, and they're definitely super competitive, which just plays into her character as essentially battle crazy gamer, in that she'll take on any challenger, any situation, to prove that she's the best of the best of the best. And she really is a fun character. I wouldn't mind seeing like a side story with just her like doing some weird, crazy adventure kind of thing, because she's super fun, and she's a lot more lighthearted, I think, than some of the main storyline. And then she's just there like to kick butt and take names, and your main character is a little more morose occasionally because he has more serious problems, and that's fine.
It's funny you should say that, because it's very subtle. You probably didn't notice it when you're reading them, but each book has actually got a focus on one of the minor characters. For instance, book 2 focuses on Brock's dilemma, his conflict with Brock, and then it shows Chloe with her confrontation with her brother, where she realizes, when she thought he'd gone missing and stuff. And so the next one is actually Sienna's one, because as you say, she likes to have fun, but at the same time, serious aspects of the game and, relating to the real world are being brought in, and she has to kind of be confronted by her friends, having problems with this, and she has to kind of step up to that. That's what I want.
No, that's good. No, like I said, it can't always just be about the main character. That story is nice, but it's always like it's not as fulfilling as like giving other things for readers to enjoy as well. And I think you do a really good job like making those other characters interesting and important, and adding like different viewpoints to the same situation. So kudos.
Hey.
Excellent. Okay, let's see. So specifically, let's talk about book 3 in the series, because like this to me, like this almost is like this is the end of the first arc at least. Like the main character kind of gets what he's been looking for this entire time. How does this story start out? How is it different from the other novels in the series?
Well, as I said, whether or not it continued was determined on whether or not my publisher wanted more books. So I saw a really good way, and most series do that, to show a larger story arc at work is to introduce a larger villain, to introduce someone who has been essentially in the shadows the whole time, manipulating stuff. And so I was like, right. But at the same time, if you introduce a main story villain, then it's like a ticking time bomb and you're only just waiting for them to defeat it. And that's the end of the whole series. So I thought, why not just introduce the most badass villain I can think of, someone who's, kind of been playing off the events and emotions of these people for such a long time. And that's what I tried to do. So the ghost in the game is kind of the idea of the ghost in the machine idea that I was playing off with this guy. Right.
And that ultimately ends being like the big baddie that nobody knew was there. And I think a lot of this, I say this in my review of the novel, is that this feels like the most like a cyber thriller story, because a lot of the story is about finally figuring out and following the clues about who this guy is, and the voice in their heads, the mysterious force that's been compelling everybody, and like having all these events going on in the game. And the title is a big clue, but I think like, from the beginning, like, he was introduced, but it's like, it almost feels like a minor footnote in the story, and it's like, wait, I remember that thing that they said at the beginning of the novel. Who knew? I was like, good planning. But at the same time, a lot of the story is very cyber thrillery. I think each one of your novels has kind of increased that particular aspect of the story. Like book 1 was a lot about like, here's the game, here's the world, here's all the tech, here's someone on his adventure, getting more powerful, and there was still some sleuthing, but it was like a more minor part of the story. And then in book 2, it becomes a bigger part when you actually have the core footage that proves the thing that they think they're going for. And then in book 3, like a good chunk of it is cyber sleuthing, and that's. And I liked that increasing pace because it made each novel feel connected, but at the same time, it gave each an opportunity to be something slightly different at the same time.
I'm a big fan of plot-heavy books. Like, don't get me wrong, as you say, the sleuths, the grinding, the getting from one stage to another, and in order to essentially progress the plot. I really find it hard not to just go, okay, the next plot element is this. Let's get to that. And so I'm like, no. In order to get to this element, you need to go into this dungeon and get these specific items in order to give access to the place where you're going to learn about these things. And it's just a fun way of incorporating game mechanics and grinding and all the fun stuff into the plot.
Perfect. Now, and that kind of ties in perfectly into like, the game mechanics of the story are very interesting. What inspired you to create these particular mechanics?
See, there are actually a few mechanics that I didn't realize, had been used by other people. Because I hadn't read a lot of LitRPG when I wrote these books. I didn't even know LitRPG was a thing before I wrote these books.
Yeah.
So when it came down to it, like a lot of them are just, the usual, look, they're the different elemental type magics. There's the different blades and their different qualities, and then there are different abilities that can kind of, mix between the different niches. And the niches are interesting because they're not races or classes or anything like that. They're just you need certain things in a group of people in order to complete a dungeon easily or better or more efficiently. And so that's why I call them niches rather than, classes or races, because that kind of implies a lot of things. So one of the things I actually got told by Giacupa, I think his name is the author. He read a book and he said the temperature tolerance was something he hadn't seen much of. Have you read many books with this sort of temperature idea incorporated into it?
No, I actually haven't. I mean, I've read plenty of novels with like elemental influences where like hot, cancels out cold, or it's more, or, hot is more effective against a certain element like ice or something. But actual temperature variances affecting the game. No, I haven't.
First one.
There you go. See, there you go. And I think it's more along like, a lot of us don't always think of the same things. And I think that what I love about our genre is that we can all start from the same point of like, I want to write a novel about a game. And we come up with so many great ideas just because a lot of it is just wishful. Like, oh, I wish I would see these things in a game, or I wish I could play with this particular mechanic in a tabletop or a video game or whatever. And so I think a lot of the inspiration of these individual aspects comes from our own experiences. So I'm like, hey, yeah.
Yeah. What the thing about the Dream State I find is that it's a very broken game. And because it's broken in so many ways, it's almost like you can create your own way of breaking the game to make you, unique. And so it's almost like, taking advantage of these little loopholes in the game is what allows Noah and different characters to kind of become, their own sort of badass.
Cool. Now, can I ask you, like, are you a gamer by chance?
Yeah, I've been gaming for forever. I'm a big fan of the Final Fantasy games. Like, wow, like those are my childhood right there. But like some of the more modern games, I find that like the internet has kind of ruined them for me a little bit because I always get spoiled or like I hear like top 10 scenes in this thing, so much clickbait. But yeah, so I can't really get as exciting as I used to be able to.
No, and also like you're grown up and you have actual like job things to do now, and and that always happens. Like at least that's the experience I find with talking with authors, that we all gamed when we were young, like nonstop, and we have all these shared memories and all these shared experiences from these games that we love. But then as we grow up, it's like, oh, we just don't have time. We got grown-up responsibilities, and so LitRPG kind of fulfills like that same kind of vibe of like, oh, I can read a novel and feel like I played a game for 100 hours.
Yeah, exactly right. It's a very good medium for that sort of thing, especially in a way that I find that when you get older, your learning curve almost goes up a bit because you're like, oh, I'm not like a kid anymore. So when you're reading a book, it's almost like, oh, everything's I'm watching it. I'm playing a game vicariously, I guess is a good way to put it.
No, I think that's absolutely true, and it kind of feeds into the same kind of YouTube generational experience. Like, oh, I'm okay with like watching someone else play. Because I get to see how they do it, I get to see how their own experiences, and then I can still dream and imagine about how I would do that and how I would like fit into this game without having to put like the time of like 100 hours of like testing out character builds or like learning level map designs to like be efficient at a particular concept.
I always have a let's play in the background somewhere when I'm writing.
See, there you go, all kinds of cool stuff. So, speaking of the LitRPG genre, I mean, I classify these novels as LitRPG. Do you as well? Because you mentioned that you wrote the first book before you actually realized that this was a genre.
Yeah, LitRPG found me. What is it? Yeah, I kind of thought to myself, like, I'd read books like Ready Player One, and I even before that I'd watched anime like Dot Hack or Sword Art Online. And I had watched movies like Exorcist, so I knew there were, I guess you would say game immersive stories when it came to, stuff I enjoyed, just general sci-fi and fantasy. But when I wrote it, I was just like, okay, well, let's try and take some of those elements together and make my own kind of take on it. And then when I realized that LitRPG was a thing, I was like, oh, kind of fits. Yeah, sure. Let's go with that. Yeah, totally. And the community has been very welcoming.
Perfect. Let me ask you, how did you find LitRPG?
I actually found it because my publisher, I think my publisher found the hashtag, and then they linked me to the Facebook group, and I was like, I'm home.
Perfect. So you found the LitRPG community through your publisher, letting you know that it kind of existed, and then you're just like, oh, you fell in love. What was the first like LitRPG title you actually recall like reading then?
Oh, reading Running Dogs, which is it's actually a book by a New Zealand author, like done in like the 1980s, and that was a very long time ago, very old. I mean, I also remember watching Tron, so that was kind of ish.
Ish, yeah, definitely ish.
Yeah. But yeah, that was the first one, and that was done by a New Zealand author. So I was like, well, if he can write a book about playing the games, I mean, why would you want to do anything else? I mean, if you're a writer.
No, absolutely. I don't think I could write anything else besides this. So I definitely get that feeling.
It was quite interesting, though, because when I realized that LitRPG was a thing, I was just like, well, does my book fit under the LitRPG term? I was like, it's more like a fantasy sandbox than an RPG. You know what I mean?
No, but you definitely have RPG elements. I mean, you have elements in there, but I do realize that when you wrote it, you weren't gearing it towards a particular community. You were just writing it as a thing you liked. With your experiences and your own kind of concept, like, oh, I would love to play this game or have this interesting like ideas of like drug-induced dream states and a bunch of different things. But it's still, to me, like it fits. There are quite a few novels out there that were written pre-lit RPG boom, I guess, that still kind of meet it. But you can usually kind of tell, like, oh, when people like realize it's a genre and then they start like gearing their novels towards like a specific reader expectation versus just like, oh, this is what I love. You guys like it, great. I love the community. If you don't, that's cool too.
Yeah, it's so limiting. If you find something and then try and box your story into it just so it sells to that specific genre, I couldn't do that. What attracts me to fantasy and science fiction is that lack of limitation.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the trying to mush your story and your idea into a box is, I think it's, that definitely, you can usually tell when somebody's almost rebelling against the box a little bit, but they still need to make money. And so they do it anyways. And like, it never really meshes well. Like if you want to write in the LitRPG community and you just have to, I mean, the guidelines we've established, I think, as a community aren't exactly limiting. They're just like, oh, you send a video game or an RPG world. And there has to be RPG progress. And that's kind of it. And like, those are two lines, but it's sometimes like, to me, like it still allows like plenty of fantasy and sci-fi opportunity.
You must get so sick of seeing like people trying to force the relevance of the game with the plot. It's just like, how contrived can you make this?
Yeah, sometimes, and it lands some people, and I think when people feel like they're forced to do a thing, they don't enjoy it as much, and so they don't enjoy writing it as much, and that comes through the text. But if you're somebody who loves talking about game mechanics, somebody who loves talking about like their experience essentially as a gamer and incorporating a cool story with it, I think those are the ones that resonate the most with people because they feel like genuine experiences that people can relate to, and that's cool, and I love that about the genre.
Yeah, I mean, I bet though, for every triangle you slot into a triangle-shaped, opening, you get enough circles that you're like, no, come on, get that circle in there. It's not quite LitRPG, but come on.
That can definitely be the case. Now, when it came to your own novels, do you do like a lot of research for your stories, or is it just you make it up as you go along?
Well, the thing about fantasy that I like is that you can distance it from reality, and what I find is that the more distance you put between your book and reality, the least research you have to do, which is great. Yeah. But at the same time, if you've noticed, did you read First in the Game?
Yeah, I've that's the novella you wrote, right?
That's the short story.
Yeah, the short story for Brock, I think, right?
Yeah, it's based on his blog sort of post that he did before the events of the book. But what's interesting about it is that it's actually a lot of the experiments and a lot of the people involved in it are real people, and that took a lot of research, as you can imagine, for actual scientists doing actual experiments. So that was one example of, something I had to do research for.
Yeah, excellent. I know a lot of like gamers and RPG writers, like they'll take tons of research. I mean, personally, I'm currently researching like Roman culture, and like gladiators, because I'm including in like the latest thing that I'm writing. It's like I'm always curious, like see what other writers kind of do to either create realism or just brush up on something they may not know as much about. So thank you very much for that.
Well, that's why LitRPG is so good, is because there's a lot of people who've already have knowledge of games that they can ground those stories into. So they don't really need to research because they've already got that knowledge base.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And we all pull from our own experiences. Like, not all of us have played the exact same games, but a lot of us have played the same similar games that we can find commonality and in the writing. Let's go on to a few writer questions for you. Why do you write?
Why do I write? It's fun.
There you go. See, I was gonna be like, I have bills to pay. No,
No, I have a long family history of accountants, and my father was like, "Listen, if you want an easy life, become an accountant." I'm like, "No, I want a fun life." What do you find fun? Writing.
No, that's not. I think it's generally it's a genuine experience. Like, how did you get into writing? I think that's a better question than like, why do you write? But like, how did you start?
Well, as a child, I guess I always wrote stuff. I mean, I wrote my first book when I was like 12 or 14 or somewhere around then, and that was terrible, obviously. But for a career, I think I started writing because, as I said, I worked as a security guard at a mental asylum. So I was like, well, I can either be a paperweight and read books while watching crazy people do crazy things, or I can actually, be it safe in my house and type away and make creative worlds.
Okay, so at some point you basically made a conscious choice, like to be a writer instead of something else. And I think a lot of us have kind of the same situation. Like me personally, it was the same thing. I was like, I love this thing. I love reading about it and podcasting about it. But at some point I had a story and I gave up my job to kind of pursue this career of like sitting in front of a computer and typing away.
Can I ask what that job was?
Well, it was a janitor and a substitute teacher. I had a couple part-time jobs, like at night and then during the day. And I just had plenty of time to, like, as a janitor, plug in, play audiobooks or play text-to-speech programs for LitRPG. And it's just, I wrote a thing and people liked it. And I was like, oh, I can do a thing.
Yeah. Do the thing.
Yeah, I can be a storyteller. To me personally, I'm not a writer. I'm a storyteller who struggles to write. But that works for me right now. And I'm super happy that I made the decision, but I also know that it's a struggle for like a lot of authors to make a living at this.
Yeah. That's another element of it that like not many people want to dive into is the making the living. I'm luckily in a situation where I don't have to worry about that as much. It's complicated. I won't get into it, but okay. It's really freeing just to be able to kind of not force it, you know what I mean? Not have to worry about forcing those circles into the triangle slots.
Yeah. And it's okay that people do this for a living and that's how they view it as like a business, and they write to market and because they want to specifically make money because they have bills to pay. I understand that philosophy. I couldn't do that. I genuinely couldn't. Like that's not me. But I respect that they have that motivation.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's a noble cause and all that. But when we're probably going to get into this later when we talk about the difference between traditional publishing and indie publishing. But for indie publishing, I imagine it's a bit of a gamble.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But you also have the opportunity to reap the greatest reward, I think, as well. Yeah, it's absolutely a gamble. At the same time, you can lose big, but you can win big, and it's all up to you.
Reward.
Yeah, you're the only one who kind of decides like the stuff you put into it, and it hits something with an audience or it doesn't. You don't control that as much, but you're kind of you're your own boss. And like in any business, whether it succeeds or fails, is kind of more on you than necessarily the audience.
Yeah, it's definitely a pro to the decision to do that, to follow that path. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, a few more writer questions. Do you have a specific routine for writing? I'm always curious about this.
No, I'm pretty sporadic, to be honest. I mean, I won't write for like months on end, and then suddenly I'll just pump out a book in about a month or two, and it's so much funner that way.
Wow, man. I mean, I always appreciate the ways different people write because a lot of this is art. I'm finding like there's a creative side of it, and then there's like a structural side of it. And the structural side is easier for me to understand because I come from like a math and science background, and so structure makes sense to me. You know what I mean? That's why game mechanics make sense to me. That's why I can write about those. I can do spreadsheets and spreadsheets of like game mechanics and formulas. But the creative portion of like putting a story together is often more challenging. I'm kind of in a slump this week personally. Like I haven't got much writing done, and I should have. But I don't know if I could take months off without like doing something. For me, like I have to write. I try to write something every single day if possible, and that's just a different way of going about it. But like, I definitely couldn't write something a whole novel in a month though. That seems that's whoa, it's impressive.
I think it's like the job mindset, the idea of having to wake up and do something every day and just have a routine set. Whereas with me, I just get almost like, the muse kicks in and suddenly I'm just like, okay, I have to get this down or I'm going to explode.
No, yeah, I've heard that before. I've heard that from other, like authors, like people who like write for a living, people who like, they're like, the muse spoke to me today. So I wrote 20,000 words, or I did a 10,000 word sprint. And I'm like, who's this muse? Can I get her number?
Oh, no. It's obviously it's a metaphor for just some sort of badass imagery or some sort of music that was like, okay, I can imagine a scene to this as a badass scene. I have to get this scene out. How do I build up a story to get to this scene?
Right. No, I get the metaphor. I'm like, still, if she was real, I would love to get her digits. That seemed like it would make my job much easier. Talking about another author question, though, you a pantser or an outliner?
Oh, definitely a pantser. As I said, I just go nuts.
Yeah, and I think the muse speaks to you more as a pantser. I've noticed like a lot more people have used that expression, or at least because pantsing is just stream of thought, and so you need inspiration, I think, there.
That's one of the upsides. If you're a pantser, you kind of need a developmental editor on your side because they're going to be the ones that make sure that it makes sense by the end. Because if you're a pantser, you just do it, as you said, to do it off the seat of your pants. So it can be crazy.
Absolutely. And I've read some stuff where it's like it's going along in a certain direction and then it makes a hard right turn. I'm like, oh, that was an interesting day for that author. I didn't see it coming because it wasn't foreshadowed. But at the same time, sometimes they're very interesting turns. And those are kind of the playbacks between like being an outliner and being a pantser. Like you can be both. You can be something in the middle. There's no problem with that. I'm kind of something in the middle person myself, but like full on pants mode, I'm like that can be very interesting, but it can also be very wild and unstructured and all over the place.
Yeah, twists are great fun when you're pantser because some of the twists you don't know are going to happen. You're just like, oh, okay, so we're doing this now. And so later on in this, when you're in the editing stage and developmental editor, the editor's like, where did that come from? You're going to have to set up some, plot threads to make that make sense. And I'm just like, you're right, maybe.
No, and I wish some authors were like, yeah, they would have like had a development editor to tell them like, you didn't set this up very well. This seems weird and out of nowhere. And I'm like, okay, it like the different writing styles for like that's a lot of the art into this particular process and writing is that you never know what everybody's going to produce, and you never know sometimes where it's going to go. Even as the author, like your characters sometimes just do things that you're like, that makes sense. As I'm writing it, I didn't see it coming though, and that's always some interesting. So for writing itself, or for creative, whatever you want to say, what's the hardest or the easiest thing about writing for you?
I would say the hardest thing is editing, but the easiest thing is the first draft. As I said, I get them out in about a month, so they just kind of fly out of me, which is kind of strange. But what I think is interesting, though, is that when I'm writing a first draft, and I'm kind of at the halfway point, this is what I was, because we're doing spoilers for book 2, I was like, right, I need to type all these plot threads to do with the transfer orb, with the beta testers being overdosed and all that stuff. And once they get the orb, you're like, okay, well, that's the end of the book. It's too short. I mean, because my publisher split into 2. So I'm like, well, what can I really do to do this, to make this an actual book. And I'm just like, what if Noah became a bad guy for a little while?
Is that where that came from? Like, that's really where that came from, man?
Well, I was in a car crash. Every single book has something to do with either being in a car crash or a car being mended or something to do with that. And I'm always like, and when I was in the car crash, I was on the way to dinner and I was really hungry. And I was just like, you idiot, you ran into my car. I just wanted to go to dinner. I have no sympathy for you. And it made me feel like a bad guy. And I'm just like, what if Noah had that to one of the minor characters? And that was like, God, that's evil.
Wow, because I mean, I have to remember, I remember reading that end of that book too, and I'm like, this is an interesting choice, because it kind of makes your main character unlikable for the end of that story, and those were a lot of the review comments on that particular, like, he becomes evil. What's up with that? And there's a little bit of, I remember like reading a little bit of outrage about the end of book 2. Like you totally resolved it in book 3. Like you introduced it, like he's like that's kind of told from their perspective, and he kind of comes back to that viewpoint of like, oh, he's our hero again. But like I remember being at the end of book 2, I'm like, this is definitely a choice. I'm curious to see where it goes, but I didn't see that coming. And you know, whether you think it's good or bad, it definitely was a particular. But I'm super surprised that it came from the editing process.
And that's the point of it. It's supposed to come out of nowhere. It's what a twist does. But it was funny. My partner's reaction to when he gets blown off of Apollo's lookout at the very end. He's like, he's badass. He's suited out. He's got 2 of the color blades. He's walking towards this noob, and she just blows him off the side of the building. And it's just like my partner was just like, yes, he was being such a douchebag. Finally.
Yeah, no, I'm like, oh, wait, wasn't he the hero at the beginning of the story? Yeah. No, he's not. So there you go. That's what you get now for being a jerk.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So wow, that's just like a very, I love these like little like stories, like how these things get developed, because my wife is the same way. I wrote a book called Project Alpha, and at the end of it, she was like, yeah, that bad guy got what he deserved. He was being a jerk to the main character the entire time. And those are always the moments when my wife made her read for me. And when she reads, I always look for like I listen for the points where she like giggles or, you know, laughs or like cheers or whatever. And I always ask her, what did you just read? I'm like, oh, and that's the point I try to emphasize, or maybe like, you know, highlight in the novel, like, oh, make sure that this is a good point. Because those are always the cues, like, oh, that for whatever reason, for whatever scene it is, that impacted that person. And so those are always the coolest moments for me.
Yeah, it's like a test screening almost for a movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are always fun, because you don't get that with your like beta readers necessarily from the internet. You can't see them like cheer out loud.
Yeah. I swear to God, I'm funnier in my books than I am in real life.
Well, you seem pretty funny now, so I think that's okay. I mean, I think there's a nice follow through and balance. Speaking specifically of a novel, what was that?
Maybe it's just my partner who thinks so.
No, like, hey, as long as our partners are happy with us, I think that's the only thing that really matters. Like, so. Speaking of like writing a series as opposed to the individual novel, like when you wrote book 1 in the Dream State Saga, did you already plan out a 3-book series, or was it just like, oh, this is the one thing I'm going to write?
Basically, the way I wrote it was that I set up each prior event to a more exciting event, so I would have something to look forward to when I went back to it. And so by the time I kind of introduced the idea of the transfer orb, having the, you know, beta testers overdoses on it, and, you know, this whole plot of conspiracy and stuff, that was where the plot kind of just was like, oh, well, this is the plot now. And that's where the first book ends. So I'm like, it's not a good thing when your plot starts at the end of your first book.
No, yeah, so, it isn't necessarily, unless that's the kind of book you're writing. Because I've read plenty of... this is again slightly more technical. Like, there are different kinds of books. Like there are stories with plots and arcs and like twists at the I feel was it the third and like the 3/4 and the halfway mark. And there are a bunch of like, you know, ways to kind of create tension and everything. And then there's just some novels who are like, we're going to go on an adventure. La, la, la. Yeah. And you know, I call them slice of life, because that's what you're doing. You're following someone's slice of life adventure, and those are good too. They're just different experiences, as long as you go into them knowing what they're going to be, they're both, I think, can be both enjoyable.
Yeah, totally. It's just, for me, it was more along the lines of, I was doing that for the first half of the book.
Yeah.
You know, if you notice, like the first half of the first book was just like, that was like him, his daily life in the game, trying to accomplish these goals. And then, as you point out in your review, then the girlfriend stuff comes into it, and you're like, oh, okay, there's a completely new plot thread, and that leads off to, oh no, there's an entire new conspiracy theory that they have to solve, and then that leads off to, oh no, he's a bad guy, and it just kind of builds on itself, and it's fun how it does that, and that's why I want to write another one, because I find it really, really fun to write, but it's up to them whether or not they want to have it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Like, I guess we can start talking about that right now. It just seems so weird that someone else has to decide that you can write. To me, I mean, I get that that's the way it's been for like a very long time in publishing. But like as an indie publisher, somebody who recognizes that there are just tools out there where you can just put a thing and people will buy it. And I know my experience as a writer has been very unusual, and that I found weirdly immediate success for a thing that I like, the first thing I'd ever written, which is like makes very a lot of like real writers like really mad. They're like, I've been working at this for 30 years and you get success with a thing you kind of wrote on the side. But it just seems weird to me that someone else decides whether or not you're going to write a thing. Like, can you, like, since you have a publisher, can you still write independently, or do you just write for them?
No, I can write independently, but it's more along the lines of they kind of more or less they own the series of Dream State Saga, because they have all the cover art. Their editors have backlogged all of the story. They've kind of made it their own, which has been really nice because it's really helped with the plot and stuff. It would be a mess otherwise, I swear to God. But if I decided to go off on my own, I would have to essentially find a new cover artist, someone else to edit it and all that stuff. And I just, like, even when I started, I didn't have the money for that. So, right. I guess I could have done it, but at the same time, it was the cheapest option.
No, yeah, you're absolutely correct. Well, let's talk about this first. What is it like to work for a publisher? Like, what are the terms? Like, what are the things that they dictate versus the things that you have kind of control over? Tell me a little bit about that experience working for a publisher in general.
Well, so basically you have your entry stage, which is essentially you submit to them. Okay. And, it's pretty easy to do. And then they choose out of like 100 people. So that's another thing that's beneficial about being an indie is you don't have to be chosen. You can just do it yourself. But when you're chosen, you're like, oh, I'm special, I got chosen. And then they're like, okay, now you have to work. You have to really work. And I'm just like, okay, what do I have to do? And they're like, well, okay, you're going to be a part of these collaborations. Like, for instance, at the moment I'm working on a tabletop board game book that's 1 in 5 of a series that, they've got partners in. They've, kind of signed on us. So they were like, do you want to do this? And I'm like, it's an opportunity. Say yes, go on, do it. And then I'm like, okay. So, at the same time, I have to go to them first for my next one because I've got there's a clause in their contracts, which is like, first right of refusal or something like that.
Right.
But at the same time, I've got books because they don't do adult books. So I have an adult series, an epic fantasy adult series that I knew they wouldn't go for. And I asked them and they're like, no, you can go who you want with. And so I went and did that with another publisher and they allowed me a lot more freedom. For instance, they gave me back my audiobook rights and now I'm able to, arrange that for myself. And that's pretty cool.
Cool. I think that's very interesting. Like, so I want to make sure I understand the structure a little bit better is that, besides the submittal process, which is very much like they either choose you or they don't. Once you're with them, they provide essentially all the resources you need to go from first draft to putting on Amazon or putting it into a physical condition, and they handle most of the details outside of your actual writing. But they also, I think you mentioned previously, like they actually also influence what is actually going to be published. Like they'll take your first draft and they'll say, we would like for you to make these edits and these changes, and and that's also part of the developmental writing process, and that somebody does the same thing. But the publisher, I think, you mentioned, they have a lot of influence on what you're actually going to be finishing. And in this particular case, I remember you mentioning before we started this, was that your publisher doesn't do adult books. So they're minimal cursing. A lot of their stuff goes towards kids. So no sex stuff and drug use. And I think you mentioned before, like your original first draft of this novel was very different. How was it different? And how did that change with them?
Well, a lot of there was a lot of sexual innuendo in the first one, and they were like, "Well, we want to, sell to a family audience, and this is obviously a young adult book. So if you want to sell to this audience better, it's like, here we go. This is what we're going to do." And it's worked out well because I've managed to get my books on shelves in the young adult areas and bookstores, which is like, all the pretty books, and you're like, "Oh, here we go." But at the same time, you're like, well, they're kind of, there's hints at like romance and stuff, but all of the, like for instance, in the first book, there's a scene where Kerry essentially disrobes and she's in her default avatar gear. What is it? And in the in the original book, it was a bit more scant. She was a bit more scantily clad, and there were a bit more innuendo there. And I had to kind of change that around so that it didn't actually, it was just like, oh, she's wearing her default gear, which is kind of like a bra and underwear, but nothing sexy about it. So I guess it was one of those changes where I was willing to make the sacrifice, and I didn't really had any complaints about it. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just think it is interesting. Like I said, you're always going to negotiate with your development, or like what needs to be there, what doesn't, what slows down the plot, what is going to offend an audience, and what, and that's always going to be the case. Even if you're like doing indie publishing and you have a development editor, they're still going to give you these same suggestions. There's very similar suggestions because everybody has a different point of view, and their job is to kind of guide your craziness a little bit into something that's, going to be accepted by an audience. So that, there's nothing, different about that. I am just curious about what the original draft was to see how different it was personally. Because I think there's so many, I know you did cool things with this story. And in reading it the first time, I was like, I'm like, I felt like there were things that were changed. I mean, there were just like so many cool things about like the drug use, like the use of the Dream State drug itself. Like that could have been like a really cool commentary on like the pharmaceutical industry. And I mean, there's a lot of additional content here that I think has an audience. And I understand from your publisher's point of view, like, oh, we do YA stuff. That's totally cool. But like a lot of the LitRPG audience is grown-ups. We're a lot of us, like I'm going to say like 80-90% of this particular community, we're grown-ups who are gamers, who are gamers. And so we're cool with adult stuff. And there are plenty of people who do well as like harem writers or like some adults, more adult content. Like I said, I'm curious. That was all.
Well, a good example, like for instance, a lot of the stuff that the book covers, for instance, the overdoses, you see people like overdosing, like it's like they've overdosed on heroin or something like that. And it's got a lot of what it originally had. It's still hinted at, it's still there. It's right. Just not as, I guess not as in depth, like, for instance, a good example is when they go over to David's place in the flashback at the very start of the book. It used to talk about like how his flat looked like kind of like a drug den, you know what I mean? And how it was just the dankest place. And they were like, oh, I don't want to be here. But obviously a lot of that had to be kind of toned down. So it was like, oh, it was just a grubby place.
Yeah. Okay. Well, like I said, I'm curious about what the differences would be. And I've known some authors who do two different versions of it. They kind of tested the market, like, oh, what if I do like the really racy version I like, and then like the cleanup version that people will hopefully complain less about. And I know Daniel Shinofun did a version of that. I know another author who's kind of doing the same thing. And they both kind of found like, oh, the regular version with all like the intentional stuff I wrote in there, even though it's not like super sexy, sold like 40-1 better than like the censored, cleaned up version. You know what I mean? So that to me, right on its own. So I was like, oh, it's okay just to do more adult stuff. I may understand your publisher doesn't want to make it because they have a brand that they're representing, and that's definitely part of their position. But like, I think that's again the difference between indie and publisher, in that your publisher has a lot more influence because they're paying your bills. They're paying you to write a story, and they're the ones who are putting up front all the money for the cover artists, for the developmenters, for your editors, for your line editors, and they're paying you. How does that work, by the way? Like, do they pay you an upfront fee or something that gets taken out of your royalties? I'm always curious about the.
Well, the royalties just I don't get much at all. So a lot of the stuff is just like, that you're getting a good deal because all of the stuff that you'd have to pay if you're doing indie stuff you get for free. But like, it really depends. What was I going to say? I was just thinking. Now you gave me an idea, because they don't have the rights forever.
Yeah.
So maybe an adult version might come out in the future.
Yeah, it might be something. Or you can always, in the meantime, I guess, write something else in the same, probably not the same world. But I think because they have the rights to it currently as the series, and they're gonna have it for, I'm assuming, like 5-10 years, something like that, or like a certain set of period of time where they have exclusive rights to that particular, expanding that world because they purchased it. I guess. Like I said, this is one of the things I'm kind of curious about, how those rights work. Is it okay to ask you about like those specific details with the publisher?
I'm sure it's fine. Honestly, I should really read the contract a bit more closely.
always a good piece of advice. Read your contract.
Yeah, I think it's about 3 years. But, okay. If I do end up doing an adult version, I'll definitely. I'm just thinking of now, just making it a lot more gross than it was.
No. I mean, I'm just saying. I'm kind of curious because we're both adults. We have. I think this is a little slightly behind the scenes things. Like when we were talking before, you're like, I have to watch my language and the things that I say here because I'm representing my publisher, and I'm like, and then I feel like that's kind of the attitude of writing for a publisher as well. Like, you have to kind of contain some of your word creative ideas because someone else is paying the bills. And that's always the case in a job. Like, that's no different than like working at McDonald's or working for a corporate entity, in that you don't get to do everything you want. They're paying you money to do a certain thing, a certain way. And that's just the agreement. And that works for people. You have a steady paycheck, and not everybody can say that. You have income, your bills are paid, hopefully. But at the same time, you can't always do the weird, crazy things you like. And that's just kind of the trade-off. And it works for some people, it works for doesn't. I know in one of the things I've always seen from people who say they like their publisher situation, that it's less of a hassle. Do you find that to be the case, like for you as a writer, as the creative, that it's less of a hassle to do with all that other stuff?
Oh yeah, no, there's so much stuff that you don't have to worry about when you've got a traditional publisher, because I decided to do some of the marketing myself just to get involved with the community and to get to meet these people, but I don't have to do that if I didn't want to. A lot of the stuff to do with Amazon, and a lot of the marketing, a lot of all the money that they put into it, you don't have to worry about any of that. It's quite a load off your back, and all you have to worry about is writing.
Yeah, and that totally works for people. I was surprised at how much other stuff there is to do this as an independent author, I guess. Like, you have to hire your own cover artists, you have to find them on the internet, or you have to get recommendations from other authors. You have to negotiate a contract and figure out your pay per rate or whatever you're doing, and that may vary between artists. And then you have to hire editors for your work because it's a pain in the butt to do it yourself. And I did it my first book, and it's just like reading over it for the 10th time. The entire like 100,000 words, or mine was like 130,000 words. Novel, like you want to just tear your eyes out. And you just miss stuff.
And if you've ever published something that you've edited yourself, and you look back over it after it's out in the wide world, you're like, I was so blind.
No, you always miss things if you're doing it on your own, because you've created it, and so it's just human nature to kind of like skip over the things that you're already familiar with. You know what I mean? So if it's the 10th time, you're missing stuff. So it's always better to have like either a group beta readers or just to hire an editor. And it can be, it's definitely an investment of money. And like it's usually at least $700 to $1,000 for a line editor. I don't know how much is going to be for a development editor. It just kind of depends on what you're marketing at, what kind of deals you make. But, a cover artist can be, equally as much, like $5. I got a good deal of mine, but it's like, I've heard it from like $5 to $1,000 for cover art. And I know it can vary. And it's just the hassle of like doing all that stuff and then putting it to market and doing your own advertising, and figuring out like all the advertising platforms, like, oh, the Google platform of advertising versus the Amazon advertising versus the Facebook and Twitter advertising platforms. That's all it can be a hassle for people, but the rewards on the other side are that you make most of the money back. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, you kind of have to calculate that with what you spent. So it's kind of, don't get me wrong, I'm sure it's probably more beneficial in the end because you get, what is it? The Amazon is like 70% royalties or 80%? What is it?
I think it depends on where you price it at. Like if it's $2.99 above, I believe it's like 75%. Don't quote me. You can look it up, but it's something along that lines of like royalty, return versus at anything below that, I think is like 30%. Again, don't quote me, but it's, it's a different number depending on what the price point is. But even then, I think that's still better than the royalties you get from a lot of publishers, I think. Is that the case in your experience?
I don't know if I can actually say.
Okay, that's not a problem.
But at the same time, it's like I get the benefits of both sides. For me, I like, as you say, some people just don't like to bother with all the technical stuff. And I fall under that.
Yeah, it's definitely a hassle. But it's also, for me at least, it was an interesting skill set to learn. And that once you know how to do it, it's like, once you have an editor, once you have a line editor or development editor and a cover artist, well, then it's just like continuing on with them as long as you're satisfied with their work. So like the initial burden of learning all these things is usually within the first book, you know what I mean? After that, it's just kind of continuing on and knowing that you have to put aside a little bit of money for, those expenses. And it's the same thing with an audiobook. It's kind of a hassle to figure out whose voice you want to use. But once you have a relationship, once you have your price point set and your contract stuff, then it's just like, we continue on whenever I need to make an audiobook. And, all those different ways of like funding what you do, is the benefit.
There's another dimension to it, to do with the community, the LitRPG community, is that because the indie, publishers, I found that I have a different attitude to a lot of the people who are selling in the community because I don't have as much at stake.
Right.
And so I kind of come off a bit airheaded, a bit devil may care sometimes. And people are like, this is money that we're talking about here. You gotta be serious. This is people's careers. And I'm just like, I just want to be friendly and get along with everyone. And maybe, hey, look, I did a book, but some people are obviously a lot more serious about it than others, but it's just something I've noticed in the attitude is that I don't have that risk. And so I don't appreciate the gamble as much as that a lot of people have put into this.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. Like there's a larger risk in doing it yourself. Like you can win big. And you can also lose big in that if something crazy that you write that you love doesn't have an audience for it, like it just doesn't land with someone or with land the larger community. Oh, okay. That's 6 months or for me anyways, 6 months that you took to write that thing. It feels like a waste of time and you could have like been having like a regular job and made more money on it. And I am, and like just frequenting like some of the writer groups on Facebook, like I won't name anybody, like there are plenty of writer groups. But that frustration is often there, and that I wrote this thing that I love. Why won't everybody read it? Why won't people buy it? And I'm like, it's probably not either as good as you think it is, or just not finding the audience that it deserves, and that's hard. And I genuinely recognize that my experience as a writer is weird. It's very unique in that I had a place in the community before I even started writing, and so I think that was just a different experience than like most people in that they have to, be judged almost anonymous, like, oh, here's a thing I wrote. I hope you guys like it. And they're like, who are you? What is this thing you wrote? And it's almost like finding a book in a bookstore. Like, you don't know who this person is. Why should you give them a chance?
No,
And
it's good. I promise. It's good. I promise.
yeah, and so the sell's a little bit harder, or like, or like the influence is a little bit harder. So, always weird stuff with any kind of niche genre like ours.
How far back does this lit RPG thing go? Because you've been with this group for a long time, I bet. Obviously, maybe from the beginning, for all I know. Yeah. But like, it must have started somewhere. Like,
most of us find the origin point in Korea and other Asian countries, where there's a huge gaming community in like Korea and Japan and China, right? And so that goes back like decades. Most of us.
I mean, the American community. So.
Oh, in the American community, I want to say at least 4 years. I think like one of the few first novels that are definitely LitRPG and aren't like virtual reality simulation stuff goes back to like D. Wolfen, and some other authors like that, where it was they were writing something specifically where there's like game mechanics and genre stuff, but it's only really about I want to say maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 years at most old in the American audience. Like, there were things written in Russia and there were things written in Korea that were being translated into English. And that's kind of where the experience comes from. But a lot of the original community members it's like not that old. Like, we've gone from 1 or 2 books a month on Amazon to 15. Yeah, like, seriously. Like, it's just like a huge flood of like, and some of them are great. Not all of them are though. And that's that's what happens when people think there's money somewhere. And that's just life. Yeah. I mean, that's going to be the case in any kind of genre. That happened with romance. That happened with like a lot of like other genres. It was like,
urban fantasy, dystopia, young adult. All of those genres just were like, it's making money. I hope I can at least have a little bit of credence on that, because, as I said, I didn't know about LitRPG or the market or anything before I wrote my book. So I hope I come off a little bit more innocent than some of the people who are like, I'm jumping on the bandwagon.
No, like I said, you're like, what you wrote, I think for a lot of, at least for me, I'll speak for myself only then. When I read your novel, I was like, this isn't actually meant to be lit RPG. Because you can tell reading it comes from a different point of view of like, I'm not going to include a bunch of like stat numbers and character sheets. Like, none of that's there. Like, there's no like character sheet where there's like, strength, ability, and that's not necessary for a LitRPG story. I think a lot of people confuse that with like, this is the kind of RPG mechanics that I'm used to seeing, but that's not the only kind that exists in the world. And as long as that's why in like those 2 qualifiers, which one is like, it's set in a game world, or RPG game world, or a world with RPG game mechanics, and there's RPG, progression. Nothing says that it has to be a specific format. You know what I mean? And so when I read yours, I was like, this is totally LitRPG. He didn't write it as LitRPG, and you can tell that this is kind of like a video game story, but there are RPG mechanics there, and I'm cool with that. I think you said your influences were like, Final Fantasy. I'm like, yeah, that's a JRPG, guys. Just because you don't have like strength stats necessarily in there doesn't mean there's not like that game progress that we love. You know what I mean? And so when I read your story, I was like, this is so cool though. Like, there's a lot of other cool things in this that kind of leads a little more towards like science fiction. And that's perfectly fine. You still meet the minimum qualifiers, and it's a good story. And I think that's kind of the draw that you have in your series, is that it's not super heavy on like character sheets and experience points. Yeah. And that's not necessary for what a LitRPG story is. I think people just mistake I think people try to distill the genre into, how can I copy this? How can I take things that people expect and do it as a formula? I'm like, that's not necessarily the path to success. Like, yes, you do need to include game mechanics that people are familiar with, and there's a progression level. But RPG mechanics, there's just so many systems out there that aren't D&D, that aren't strength stats and dexterity and character sheets necessarily. And there's just like so many experiences from people's gaming world that still do RPG mechanics. It's just not the exact same way. And so it's not necessary to be that specifically.
So there's a spectrum, and what you're trying to say is, I'm on the spectrum.
You are on the spectrum. See? Humorous. I'll tell you, you're on the spectrum. You're definitely there.
Well, it's kind of interesting how, like, a lot of people did say, obviously this isn't LitRPG because it doesn't have the things you mentioned. Yeah. And then you're like, well, it's LitRPG light. Sure, whatever.
Whatever.
but at the same time, it's like I don't screw around with numbers because I know how you say you like it. You like keeping track of that, and it's a part of the gaming thing. For me, it's just something. I'm a plot guy. I'm a writer. And don't get me wrong, you can be both. I'm not saying you don't have to be, one or the other, but I don't screw with numbers.
No, and numbers can be hard. Like if you're not the numbers kind of guy who, like a lot of the guys who do really well is that they come from backgrounds of like programming, or they're doctors, or they're lawyers, or they're like mechanical engineers or whatever. And so numbers are their thing. You know what I mean? And so that's the point of it, the writer, like they describe their gaming experience in terms of those numbers. And so for me as like a LitRPG lover and reader, if you choose to use numbers, I'm going to hold you accountable for those numbers because they're numbers. And, there's no wiggle room with math. I mean, and so if like your stuff doesn't make sense with numbers, like I'm going to call you on it because like math is supposed to make sense. And so it's just one of those things, like people want the creativity of like a fantasy story where you can kind of do weird things and, you can want to wave it away a little bit. But once you start introducing things like character stats and health descriptions and like actual numbers, that's a lot harder to do because you have a foundation in a physical reality of like mathematics. And there's too many people who love RPG mechanics because math makes sense and real life doesn't.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I totally get it. It's funny because like no one's ever called me out on, say, is like, wait a minute, this attack did quarter of his health in this part of the story, and yet for some reason it doesn't do it. No, this is magic armor. It's very magic armor. It's okay.
See, there you go. Like you said, yeah. But if you do numbers, like you should make sure your numbers work and don't like half-ass it. It's one of those things that I find repeated. Like some people will try to include a character sheet with like a constitution stat or like a dexterity stat or whatever, and then they'll just like wiggle around the actual health stat in their numbers. Like they'll say, oh, there's a health and stamina bar here somewhere, we're not going to tell you what that is though. And I'm like, that makes those other numbers totally pointless. So I'm like, just go all in. If you're going to go all in with the numbers, go all in. Otherwise, just don't. Like, describe it a different way. Like, there are different ways of doing the RPG thing. You don't have to have numbers necessarily. Like, that's something that some people like myself. I love numbers. But not everybody does. And it's not necessarily a necessity for a good story. Like, there are other ways of showing that progress. Like, you can do abilities and ranks, and you don't have to have, like, solid numbers. Like, you look at Blaze Corbin stuff, who does Delver's LOC. Not numbers in there. There aren't. I mean, there's descriptions of powers and abilities, and there's definitely that progress as it goes on, but not a lot, it's not a number thing. You know what I mean? So like, that's just an example. Like, you can do this a lot of different ways. And
I totally agree. But it's kind of funny actually, because when it comes to like just trying to keep consistency alone, it's like, wait a minute, didn't Dream State Saga have stamina bars? What happened to them? And I'm just like, oh no, book 3 is already out. Oh.
Yeah, no. At some point,
like, no, it's okay. It's okay. Noah trained up his stamina really a lot in the ice glacier places, so he's so good that you don't have to point it out anymore. It's okay.
No, yeah, and that happens at some point. Like I think I pointed that out in my review of the novel. Like, there are no more levels. There's no like more power gaining in book 3 because they're already at the highest level they're going to be at. And so a lot of this, like those details just kind of fade away because that's where the story's gone. And that's
there's actually a comment.
Yeah.
As Chloe actually points out, he's like, we're already hero rank. Come on. All that matters now is skill, just avoiding the right attacks and, using the right ability at the right time.
Yeah, I saw that too. I was like, oh, okay, he's pointing it out for us in case we didn't see. Like, he's explaining it away. I saw that in the novel. I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, that makes sense. As long as it makes sense, I think a lot of readers are okay with it. It's when it doesn't make sense, when it isn't grounded in, some mechanic, and it's just like, oh, he's level 1, but he's beating level 75 monsters. Nice. You know what I mean? And that kind of stuff is just like, that would work in a fantasy story. It would. But once you start introducing like finite mechanics of like, oh, these are things people are familiar with, like, they rebel and they're just like, oh, that doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, as I said, consistency is and it's
important. Hard. It's hard. Like I have lots of spreadsheets with lots of information about like, oh, and I'm finding like I'm in the 3rd book in a series. I'm like, I can't remember what I did with this mechanic at the very beginning, and I had to look it up. and then I'll make notes on it just to make sure I don't forget it later.
Yeah, I there's this one thing that, like, being a pantser, you kind of are shocked by your own convenience of the plot tools you've set up beforehand that you can use later on. Like, there's a scene in book 3 where, like, all his friends are getting wiped out, and he's just like, wait a minute, I'm now in the role of the guys that kicked my ass in book 2. I can do what he did. And it was such a satisfying thing just to go, yeah, now he's got that, bring that in. It was so fun.
I was like, that was a cheat mechanic for them, but I can cheat now too. And a lot of the end of that book, of this book, is like, oh, it's very much Matrix-y kind of stuff. I'm like, oh, okay, that's like, this is getting a little more fantasy, but it's cool because you set up it as its independent world, and so the rules are very different in that independent world. I think as long as the logic is there, I think people make sense. Because I mean, a lot of the stuff that we write and read is like, it's basically still fantasy. I mean, there's a lot of like grounding of it in physics and numbers and game mechanics, but there's still room for like some wiggle room for fantasy stuff as long as you're setting it up appropriately. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's just so many funny comments from my dev editor where she's always like, why isn't he killing Noah if he can do this? Why isn't he doing that? And I have to like kind of just like shoehorn in little comments saying, maybe he doesn't want to because it's fun, yada yada.
He's teasing. He's the cat playing with the mouse.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of funny though, because when I was working on this board game book, there were 5 books, each done by different authors, and there's a plot element in it that's introduced in the Bible that everyone got. And one of the plot elements is there's a teleportation room that can teleport the heroes to wherever they want. I'm like, well, that ruins the entire journey to get to that place. So I'm going to have it destroyed at the start of the book for some, contrived reason, because otherwise there's no adventure. And no one else had thought of that. And they just were like, oh, we're just going to go on an adventure for, why you can teleport there. It's just like, yeah, you need something. You need to set up something beforehand to explain why things happen later on. Is it Kevlar's gun or Chevlar's gun? I can't remember.
Is that like a technical writing term? I don't know.
It's the idea. It's the classical idea of the term came from this idea that if there's someone gets shot in the 3rd act, there needs to be the introduction of a gun in the 1st or something like that.
Oh.
Or is it the other way around? It's called Kevlar's gun, and I think it's called Kevlar's gun, some Russian name.
It's called that now.
Basically, yeah, there you go. And it's the idea of just like, it's like Deus Machina. You've heard of Deus Machina?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the idea of it's a bad thing to do if you use a Deus Machina. Well, if you don't use a Chevlar's gun for a later on story element, these are all. Oh no, I'm getting academic.
No, these are actual writing things that I don't know. So I'm like, oh, this is suddenly educational. Please tell me.
Oh, okay.
Like, really, it is. It's interesting.
Okay, so if you don't set up plot threads for a twist that you're going to do later on, at least hinting on that these elements are going to be relevant, then it feels out of left field, or it feels like they call them ass pulls, because you just pull the plot thread out of your ass and it just comes out of nowhere, and people are left unsatisfied. And Sanderson has these, Brandon Sanderson?
Yeah, he does those great classes online for the college he works at, I think, right?
Give them a watch. They're really, really good.
Yeah.
But the idea is that he has these rules of magic that he's famous for, and he says that the satisfaction of magic use, like in a later scene, is determined in some part by how well the reader understands how the magic works.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you've got those rules in place and then see how they kind of come to fruition later on, you're like, oh, that's really smart how he used those rules to beat the bad guy. But if you just like, oh, no, the wizard came in and blew everything up because he's a wizard, you're like, well, where'd the wizard come from? What does his magic, how does it work?
Right. No, I think
so
that's always the kind of philosophy I took for LitRPG, in that, you set up your game rules the same way that Brandon Sanderson set up his magic rules, and that they're actual rules. And part of the satisfaction of like, being in a LitRPG reader is that you understand how things work. And so if you set it up in advance, you don't have to explain it again. Like, you don't have to remind people about something. But in book 2 and in book 3, you don't have to like go into all the details again, because you set it up for them and your audiences already understands like how the system works. And so when you do something neat later, it's like, oh, that, you know what? I never thought of that. That makes you sound really clever and interesting. And they feel clever with you because they're following along your journey. They're in part your character when they're reading. And so they feel clever about it as well, especially if you can foreshadow enough where they feel like they've figured it out first, then they feel really special. And that, oh, I saw that coming, ha ha ha, and I was right, you know.
Yeah, that's making your reader feel intelligent in a way that gives them the foresight. It is satisfying. It is satisfying, and I try to do that a little bit here and there. And I'm sure you do too, but I'm sure most writers do it. But it's fun to set up.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how many don't. But yeah, that's different commentary. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm gonna ask this question right now because this is one of my questions for you.
Feel free, man.
Oh man, how do you do it? How do you? I mean, I have trouble just reading average books, but you have to read so many books that end up being terrible. I mean, obviously you don't judge that right from the beginning, but how do you do it?
Oh, for me, it's I haven't written in a week, and so no. In more recent weeks, it's been challenging. But in general, I just take the time because I'm not a particularly fast reader. I am a dedicated reader though. Like I love LitRPG, and I think part of that passion it spills into like my priorities, which may be kind of skewed because I make money being an author now, but that's like the last priority for me. Sometimes, some days, in that the podcast comes first, which means the reading and the reviews come first. And so I dedicated like at least 40 to 50 hours to doing that every single week. And then I'm like, oh, I also should do some writing this week. And that's unfortunate. That's the trade-off. But at this point, I'm like, okay, I'm not starving, so I can kind of make that decision at this point. But it is just dedication. It's just like, oh, I've been a reader my whole life, so I don't read slow. But at the same time, I'm used to doing this as a reader. Like I've always been an analytical reader. I'm like, oh, taking notes on like for papers or for whatever else. You know what I mean? And so that kind of like analysis is pretty second nature to me. And so just applying it towards like the reviews it's okay. It's just making time and like staying up until 3 a.m. to finish a book that I'm reading and just taking notes on my phone like constantly so I can like review the thoughts that I have later and then putting together in a review. It's just it is time consuming, and that's all it really is for me. It's just time.
The dedication is just so impressive. I gotta say, I'm not trying to give you a big head, but
no,
man,
I mean, thank you. I've heard that a lot from people. And they ask the same question: "How do you do?" And it's like, oh, I love the genre. I genuinely love reading these novels, and I'm always disappointed when they're not great. I'm more disappointed and angry when they pretend to be LitRPG, just because it's like you're trying to make money, or maybe you don't understand. I always try to give them the benefit of like, I'm going to assume you don't understand what this genre is, because otherwise you're just a jerk. And you know, and it's like, and that, I mean, it is what it is. Like I give scores based on those experiences. And I think the scores that I've given over the course of like 600 novels or whatever is I think they're fair. And I fully admit they're based on my own opinions. With the exception of like what the definition of LitRPG is, that was decided by the community on Facebook. And besides those things, a lot of things are just kind of arbitrary. Like this works for me, it might not work for you, or it does for you and it isn't for me. And I try to explain that in the reviews, but it's just, I love the genre.
I think I can talk on behalf of a lot of authors when I say that your judgment is pretty much the gold standard when it comes to distinguishing LitRPG, because we can see it in your reviews. If you, as you say, you love the genre. So if it doesn't fit into even the spectrum, as we put it, what is it? You're like, well, obviously this doesn't get a good review because it's obviously misleading. They're obviously trying to take advantage of this market instead of actually, sharing this passion that I dedicate my life to now.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I appreciate the kind words. People have told me similar things in that they feel like I'm a gatekeeper, and they haven't always said about it in a nice way. Like they're like, you're stopping me from being successful because you said my story wasn't LitRPG. And I'm like, I didn't determine that. The readers did. You know what I mean?
you have the right because you've read everything. You've read so much.
Yeah, and thanks. And I'd like to think that I help people to kind of separate the great stories and the good stories and the stories that aren't awesome and who are actual LitRPG, because there's that. And this, I think my role is changing a little bit in that before, when there was only like 1 or 2 novels a week, it was like, oh, I'm just pointing these stories out to you because I know you guys want more. And so here are the ones that I found this week. And it might have been a search for like stuff online and stuff on Amazon and, whatever. And as the community of authors continues to grow and people come from other genres who are, looking to make a buck, but they still might write great stories, or they're not great stories. And there's just like, 10, 15, 20 novels a week sometimes that'll come out on Amazon by itself. And it's like, oh, how many people want to read them all and differentiate, like, oh, this one's great, this one sucks, this one is awesome, but not for everybody, and, all that different stuff. And I think I try to provide at least a way of like saying, oh, these are the ones that are pretending, or these are the ones that just aren't actually LitRPG for whatever reason. And these are the ones I think people will like. It might not work for me, but these are the reasons I think you might like them, even if it doesn't work for me. And these are the ones that are just super amazing. You should read them immediately and buy all the other author stuff. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
So,
I mean, I should clarify. I'm not trying to brown nose or give you a big head. I just compare what you do to what I probably couldn't do, and I'm impressed. That's it.
Oh, thank you very much. And I think we all have our own characteristics and the things that we do well and don't. And I think it's weird that this is the thing that I do well. Read and comment and review something instead of the thing I'm trying to make, pay my bills and provide, good experiences and stories for people. That one's harder for me. Like, this is much easier than writing for me personally. I should do more of the other thing though, because, I have bills, and I also I like writing. I do. I like storytelling. I have good stories in my brain. But it's also more challenging for me personally. Like, when I grew up, I wasn't a writer. You went to school for writing because you liked it, right? And it was a passion for you. And you just have these ideas and your creativity. For me, it was always, I had creativity and I made stories up my whole life, but it was never expressed in written form. Like, writing was generally hard for me. Like, it was always the subject in school that I got the worst grades in. Math and science and all that good stuff. A's, straight A's. But I never took a creative writing class. I don't know all the words that you use for that. Like, that one phrase, you're like, what does that phrase mean? And when you said it, I'm like, oh, you mean like setting up a system, like, and foreshadowing an event. And I'm like, I have experiences that from a reader's point of view, like seeing, oh, these things work, and these are part of like a good story, and this is how to set up things, because I've read, whatever thousands of books in my lifetime. But I just don't have the same skill set, and so writing is just hard. And I know a lot of indie authors feel the same way, but it's also very rewarding in that you get to express yourself. You get to take a part of your soul and put it in a story, and other people can see that part of you. And so it's very rewarding to do that kind of stuff and have people come back and say, thank you. And this made me happy. And this made me cry because of this thing that came out of your brain and your heart. So it's been a very interesting journey for me in that respect.
Yeah, well, a lot of those things that I talk about are kind of, you almost know innately in a way. I'm just putting a word to something you kind of already know. It's like philosophy, it's, people say, well, this is called. You're like, well, I already knew this thing.
Oh, okay.
But now I know what it's called.
Now I have a word for it.
Yeah, exactly.
I just don't have a lot of words, I guess, for the writing things that I do. And it's just like, okay, I try to learn. Like, I bought some books on writing, and I try to read them between actual novels that I write, and slowly, like, organization, like, it's been improving my writing, like having a structure of like, having some kind of twist that, like, what is it, the one third point and the halfway point and like the 3/4 point or whatever. Just like the structural end of it has been useful in like just organizing my thoughts and like the story structure. But that's something I had to learn. Otherwise it was just a slice of life adventure that I was writing, and it might have a point, so everybody can know it. Yeah. So great stuff. I think that's about all the questions I have, besides like, how do you get reviews and how do you do marketing? But you don't do that stuff. Like, do you do that marketing stuff still?
Yeah, well, as I said, I don't have to,
Yeah.
but I do it voluntarily because, as I said, I like to get involved with the community, look, to talk to people. I like networking with other authors. A lot of them are just, I'd like to consider them as my, just friends that I catch up with when I'm talking to them.
Yeah, no, it's fun to have
And
author friends.
yeah, and it's just one of many communities that you think, okay, well, these are some like-minded people. They write like I write, or they enjoy reading what I like to read. So why not?
Okay, perfect. So I think it's a great answer. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we headed out? Like, I think you said you had
No,
questions. Did you still have any questions for me?
I don't know. I guess someone asked me how I could sleep at night, and I said that I have reverse sleeping patterns, so I sleep during the day.
See, there you go. So I did that before. I used to work at night as a janitor. And so I would be awake from like 7 to like 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. And that was like my prime working time. And it was just like, yeah, you sleep during the day. You put on a little mask, you close the windows and the shutters, and you sleep when other people are working.
And you've come a long way. You've come a long way from a janitor to the representative of an entire genre. It's a pretty good jump.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the kind words. I don't know that I consider myself representative of the genre. I think maybe, I don't know.
LitRPG Podcast.
Yeah, well, I mean, I love the podcast, and I like to be representative of the community. But like, okay, I maybe I can go with that. Maybe a preacher, a gospel. Oh, LitRPG gospelist. I think that's cool. No. That's kind of fun. I spread the good news of the LitRPG. Have you got a minute, brother, hear the word?
Yeah, well done. Okay, yeah, I don't think there's much else other than just saying I hope you enjoy the work that I put out there, and you seem to. I'm not sure, but I don't know. It's another book, and I hope there's going to be another one in the future. But as I said, it depends on the publisher. And if they decide to go no, I'll wait till I get the rights back and release that adult version.
Yeah, I mean, you said you can write other things. I think you mentioned they just have a first refusal right, which means you have to present it to them first, and they have to refuse it before we can kind of do your own thing. So you could write another LitRPG series if you wanted to, or like something else, and be the more adult version. I don't know if you could use the same, if you could use the same name necessarily, but even if you chose a different name, like you still have the same audience. I think where they're like, this is just a different, pen name, but it's the same guy. This will be like his more adult things. You know what I mean? There's plenty of chances. It's just like,
it's funny. I came into this conversation hoping to talk about the book as little as possible and actually get into like a proper conversation, and I think we've achieved that. So I'm pretty happy.
Well, I'm good. I mean, like I said, the conversation. I try to do both for the author because I know you have a thing. You have a thing that you're promoting because you have bills to pay, and hopefully it's a good story and people love it and readers love getting it. But at the same time, it's just. This is a conversation. Like we're two dudes who happen to love the same thing. And I think that creates a commonality where we can have fun and goof around. And I know you're a little restrictive on like the things you might say because you're representing another entity, like the publisher. But like it's been fun to talk to you, man. Like it generally has. And I want to thank you for just taking the time out of your day and getting up all, early in the butt crack of dawn to talk to me, man.
Same here. Good to speak to you.
Yeah, thanks. And for folks at home, if you want to go check out his stuff, that's the Dream State Saga, which is this LitRPG series. He also has other things he's written. You can check him on his Amazon page. We'll have a link in the show notes for everything he has, including his blog, his Facebook page, his Amazon author page, Goodreads page, links to all the stuff you can go, purchase and buy for him. But thank you very much for, again, taking the time to listen to us and for joining me, Christopher. If you'll nice goodbye real quick to everybody, we'll sign off.
All right. Catch you around.
See, that's a great simple exit, like a simple entrance. There you go. That's a great way to leave them. So for everybody who's listening at home, for watching, thanks a lot for hanging out with us, for letting us hear us talk about LitRPG and writing, and so a few technical things as well. It's always fun just to talk to somebody who has a different experience with writing and publishing than I do. I like learning as much as I like reading and writing. So this is always fun for me, man. So thanks a lot so much. Everybody at home, remember till we can hang out again to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.